Greetings and blessings, YouTube. This is John the Jansenist, also known as Hell's Unicorn once again, and this is the fourth and final installment of Debunking Hitler Myths. The previous myth, or the third myth, dealt specifically with the connection of Darwinism and social Darwinism with that of the Nazis and Adolf Hitler, and I took a more conciliatory tone with that particular section than I did with the others, primarily because there is a lot of evidence to suggest that Darwinism does not necessarily in and of itself lead to Nazism, and by the same token, social Darwinism is a distinct mode of thought from that of Darwinism in that it deals with a different area of study, in this case social politics, and particularly things pertaining to human affairs rather than specific isolated biological systems, which was primarily what Darwin himself was interested in. I nonetheless also came to the conclusion that Darwin was necessary and indeed an important part of the development of social Darwinism and thus eventually of Nazism. Now, the fourth section is a little bit of a different matter than the third one, in that in here there is absolutely no way to take any kind of a conciliatory tone, because this section in particular, which deals specifically with Friedrich Nietzsche's connection to the Nazis and to Hitler, is very dishonest. It misrepresents history in probably the worst ways I've seen imaginable, and it showcases a very strong decline in the standards that historians use when studying history since the earlier historical records of Nazism going back to the 50s and 60s, when the memories of what actually happened were still fresher in everybody's minds. But I am going to read through some sections of this particular article first before I get to the actual debunking. And I'm going to begin with the opening sentence just to preface this. If Hitler followed Nietzschean philosophy or even admired his work, then where does he describe him or his philosophy? Now, it is a fact that Hitler was not really known to mention Nietzsche by name. There were a few instances where he took time to visit Nietzsche's historical monument, as it were. This article insists that this was done at the behest of Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth Forster, who was a prominent anti-Semite. Now, the thing is that if you honestly read Nietzsche's work, with or without the commentary that's provided by Elizabeth after the fact, his sister that is, you come to the conclusion that Nietzsche's works are at least marginally anti-Semitic in their outlook, specifically in that they attack the whole of Jewish culture, and more properly known as Israel's culture, which is Old Testament Christianity also, and he was a raving anti-Christian. Now, there is a very clear connection that can be made to the ideology of people like Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, who took pretty well to heart most of the ideas of Nietzsche and had a similar attitude towards Christianity and Judaism. But with Adolf Hitler, it's a little bit more subtle, and the primary reason I would argue is because he had a Christian facade to keep in place in order to keep the loyalty of the right wing of Germany, many of whom were still at least nominally Christian, even though they were far from orthodox. Now, moving on. Nowhere in Mein Kampf does Hitler even mention Nietzsche or Nietzschean terms such as Superman or super race. Of course, Hitler did think the Aryan represented a superior race to the Jews, but never in Nietzschean terms. Now, this is a pretty large distortion and kind of a I would say a disingenuous misrepresentation of Mein Kampf for a couple of reasons, and I've provided a link in the description along with several other links. You'll want to look specifically under the links connecting the Nazis with Nietzsche, and it goes through point by point with different passages of Mein Kampf and compares them against various articles in Nietzsche's various writings that show that although Hitler does not quote Nietzsche verbatim, he is definitely paraphrasing him, and he's using interchangeable terms. He's not using Uberman or super race, but he is definitely thinking in the same sort of Aryan terms that Nietzsche was, and indeed many other German philosophers during the late 19th century were. The thing that I think really should be understood is that Nietzsche and Hitler are very compatible, primarily because there was a strong culture, both an anti-Semitic culture and also a occultish culture that was inundating Bavaria, and Hitler was taken in by this, and there's links dealing with his connections with various secret societies. They are, again, a little bit, there's not a whole lot of actual words spoken by Hitler on these specific secret societies, and this is mostly because these societies tend to remain secret because they demand secrecy, so to speak. But moving on. Note that Joseph Arthur in Gobineau invented the theory of the superior Aryan race in the 1800s in his book, An Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races. Gobineau believed that racial mixture would bring out the decline of superior peoples. Gobineau influenced Richard Wagner, beloved by Hitler, and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, whom Hitler read and met, both of whom influenced early National Socialism and both mentioned in Mein Kampf. Popular in Germany in the 1900s, many Germans accepted Gobineau's ideas and no doubt influenced Hitler either directly or indirectly. Moreover, Hitler's superior race ideas sound like a combination of biblical race laws, that's bunk, I took care of that in the previous sections, and Gobineau's Aryan race ideas, but not at all like Nietzsche. Now here's the problem. Nietzsche himself has a strong connection with Richard Wagner. Now Nietzsche's relationship with Wagner became very strained later in Nietzsche's life, probably in no small part due to Nietzsche's very erratic personality shifts connected with his propensity towards mental illness. But there is a connection between Gobineau and Nietzsche, as well as between Gobineau and Hitler. You see, the thing that this particular section of the article does is that it somehow distances Nietzsche from the influences that are obvious in Hitler, and yet doesn't take into account that Nietzsche shared these influences as well. And there's specific language in the articles that I have linked to on this subject that showcase that Nietzsche, in many respects, was in line with this strain of German thought. Now, this in and of itself doesn't create a necessary link between Nietzsche and Hitler, but it definitely shows that the two outlooks are compatible in many ways. They're different in many ways. For instance, the Nazi Party was in many respects a socialistic party. It had a collectivistic view of economics and also of society as a whole. And Nietzsche had this sort of rabid anarchistic view about him that was very I would say out of character for a German thinker, and I think this is what most defenders of Nietzsche usually this is what they appeal to whenever they say that Nietzsche was separate from the rest of German culture. He was an anarchist. He was doing his own thing, so therefore he's not connected to any of this, which of course is not really a very sound argument when you take into account all of the various things that Nietzsche said. Now, they would then argue that Nietzsche was simply taken out of context by the people that were influencing him, or he, the things that he said were taken the wrong way. The problem is that if you read the whole of Nietzsche's work, and I've read most of the books that have been published that contain his writings, it's very difficult to have any kind of a context to go on because his writing is so disjointed and basically lacking in sanity that it's difficult to really get what the right way to interpret this stuff is. It's the ramblings of a madman. And the fact that people in the philosophical field continue to defend him as somehow being misunderstood, my response to that is, how do you properly understand him? I've taken 3 philosophy courses in the 5 years that I went to college, and nobody was ever able to explain to me the proper way of interpreting Nietzsche. They would give their own personal reasons for why they thought other people were misinterpreting him, but they never really got around to telling me what the proper interpretation is. Basically, his works are a mishmash of various different types of verbal diarrhea, basically. He just spewed words onto the page, reflecting his own insanity, and that was basically the end of it. And then later in this article, getting back to the subject here, they go into the issue of the Thule Society. This was a secret society that was rabidly anti-Semitic, and I included a couple links under a separate category in the description dealing with Nazi connections to the occult. And this pretty well demonstrates that the Thule Society, they were the original proponents of the swastika symbol. They had a slightly different version of it. It wasn't quite as pointed and sharp. It was had more of a curved endings to it, but it was basically the same symbol. They had adopted similar pagan symbolisms, mostly taken from Sanskrit, and Hitler, it was believed, this is cited in one of the links, was under the tutelage of a member of this particular society when he was at school, and that this society influenced him greatly. Now, the thing is that this society is strongly anti-Semitic and, as a consequence, anti-Christian, so we cannot, by good necessary consequence, continue under the illusion that Hitler was a practicing Christian if he has connections to secret societies that are pushing various forms of neo-paganism or other forms of occultism that is outright hostile to Christianity. Indeed, the Thule Society also drew from such sources as Madame Blavatsky of Russia, who is a renowned anti-Christian and a promoter of really odd and unusual Gnostic forms of mysticism. But we'll get to the conclusion of this article, and then I'll just give some final thoughts on this website before I close out here. Anyone who uses such material to justify a Hitler-Nietzsche link simply lacks historical depth, laziness of research, and has no understanding of Hitler. Now, the thing is that this entire article is so short and so lacking in actual citations that it's very hard to take this assertion seriously, saying anyone who uses such material to justify a Hitler-Nietzsche link, you're not using any material to say anything the other way, so what reason do I have to take this with any level of seriousness? Alright, and then finally, let's face it, Hitler showed no philosophical sophistication. That, I think, is a lie. He wasn't the most sophisticated person philosophically in the Nazi movement, but he definitely had a level of sophistication. And anyone who reads Mein Kampf will note that although there's a lot of political pandering, there is a level of sophistication to it. If any philosopher had an influence on him, it probably came from Schopenhauer, which Hitler does cite as an influence upon him. The way that this article is dishonest is not really that they provide you with any outright false evidence apart from what they say about Nietzsche. It's that they're using every other influence that Hitler had to say that Hitler didn't take any influences from Nietzsche. I have not heard anybody assert that Nietzsche was the only influence on Hitler, just that he was a strong one, and I think that proves to be the case when you look at the various links that I've provided in the description. So, in conclusion, I think that this article is a testament to how much the field of the study of history has declined in the past couple decades, and how atheism can lead to basically an inferior understanding of history. I invite any and all listening to this to go over to this website and to read this article. It's pretty short. It constitutes about I'd say about 3 pages of information, and it has very limited citation. It's mostly opinionated assertions, and it's not really, I would say, the best argument I've heard in terms of arguing that Hitler was a Christian, but it cites the most prominent arguments in the few citations that it does provide. So, long story short, this just goes to show that with atheists in general, you tend not to get very strong intellectual arguments, and yet you get constant claims that they are the bastions of reason, of logic, and are the true academics of our time. And if that's the case, then woe be us who live in this time. So, feel free to visit all the links and see for yourself all of the information. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. God be with you.